Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. I'm not paying $20,000 for her, my son said at the hospital billing desk while I sat in a wheelchair less than 3 feet away from him. The young receptionist froze with her fingers still resting on the keyboard. A man holding a coffee near the vending machine slowly looked up. Somewhere behind me, a heart monitor beeped in steady rhythm, cold and mechanical against the fluorescent silence of St. Catherine Medical Center. I lowered my eyes to the thin hospital bracelet around my wrist and smoothed the sleeve of my pale blue cardigan, as if that small movement could somehow make me disappear. "Ryan," I said quietly, "it's all right." But he let out a tired sigh and rubbed both hands over his face like I was the worst inconvenience of his week. "Mom, no, it's not all right," he muttered. "You should have called an ambulance covered by your insurance network. This place is ridiculously expensive." Nicole stood beside him in a cream-colored coat with gold buttons, holding her designer handbag against her hip. She didn't say anything cruel directly. She never did. But her silence always felt carefully chosen, polished into something sharper than words. She glanced toward the cashier and gave an embarrassed little smile, the kind people use when apologizing for someone difficult in public. "We just weren't expecting this tonight," she said softly. I nodded once even though no one was truly speaking to me anymore. 3 hours earlier, I had collapsed in my kitchen while making chicken soup for myself. My neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, heard the pan hit the floor through the open window and called 911 before I could even protest. Now the smell of antiseptic clung to my skin, my chest still ached faintly beneath the hospital gown, and my own son was arguing over whether my treatment was worth the cost. The receptionist cleared her throat carefully. "Sir, the balance can be discussed through a payment plan if necessary." Ryan gave a short laugh with no warmth in it. "A payment plan? She lives on Social Security and a tiny pension. There's no plan here." I watched a nurse walk past pushing a medication cart. The wheels squeaked against the polished floor. For some reason that sound hurt more than Ryan's words. Maybe because hospitals had once felt familiar to me. Safe even. But now I looked like every other elderly woman people pitied briefly before walking away. I folded my hands together in my lap so no one would notice the slight tremor in them. "I can handle it myself," I whispered. Ryan turned toward me too quickly. "With what money, Mom?" The question landed harder than he intended, and judging from the way Nicole looked down immediately afterward, even she knew it. I opened my mouth then closed it again, because the truth was I didn't have an answer anymore. Not after the prescriptions. Not after the property taxes. Not after spending years quietly helping Ryan whenever his business struggled. The automatic doors near the elevators opened with a soft hydraulic hiss. Footsteps echoed across the lobby floor. Then a woman's voice suddenly stopped mid-conversation. "Wait." The sound of heels approached quickly. I looked up slowly and saw a woman in navy scrubs staring directly at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. Her hospital badge swung lightly against her chest as she stepped closer. Ryan turned, irritated by the interruption. But the woman ignored him completely. Her eyes filled before she even spoke again. "Mrs. Hayes," she whispered. "Is that really you?" For a moment, nobody in the lobby moved. The receptionist looked from me to the woman standing beside the elevators as if she was trying to understand what was happening. The woman stepped closer, her eyes fixed on my face with the kind of recognition that comes from another lifetime. "Mrs. Hayes," she said again, softer this time. "I cannot believe it is really you." I stared at her for several seconds before something familiar surfaced beneath the years. The dark curls were shorter now. There were faint lines around her eyes that had not been there before. But then I saw it. The nervous smile she always wore during overnight shifts when she was exhausted but trying not to show it. "Amelia?" I asked quietly. Her hand flew to her chest. "Oh my God." She laughed once through visible emotion. "You still remember me." Ryan frowned beside me. "Mom, who is this?" But Dr. Amelia Brooks still did not look at him. She crouched beside my wheelchair without hesitation despite the expensive navy blazer under her white coat. "Remember you," she said. "You trained me during my first year here." You stayed with me for 16 straight hours after my first patient crash because I was too shaken to stop crying. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, though I kept my expression calm. That had been over 20 years ago. Back when my knees did not ache every morning. Back when I could work double shifts without sitting down. Back when people looked at me with respect instead of concern. Amelia stood and suddenly turned toward the receptionist. Why is Mrs. Hayes sitting out here discussing billing immediately after cardiac observation? The young woman straightened quickly. Her family was asking about payment options. Amelia's eyes moved slowly toward Ryan and Nicole for the first time. Ryan immediately adjusted his posture and offered a tight smile. We were just trying to understand the costs. Amelia nodded once, but something in her face cooled slightly. Mrs. Hayes spent 32 years in this hospital, she said calmly. Half the nurses on the 4th floor were trained by her. Nicole blinked in surprise. Wait, she worked here? The question hung in the air longer than she intended. I looked down at my hands again. The veins were more visible now. Thin. Pale. Older. A long time ago, I murmured. Amelia ignored the interruption completely. Worked here, she repeated softly. Your mother practically built the emergency response program we still use. Ryan looked at me differently then. Not warmly. Not proudly. Just confused. As though he had accidentally walked into the middle of a story he had never bothered to hear before. Amelia rested one hand gently on the wheelchair handle. There was a winter storm in 1998, she continued. Most of the staff could not even reach the hospital. Mrs. Hayes stayed for 30 hours straight. She slept sitting upright in a supply closet because she refused to leave critical patients unattended. The lobby had gone strangely quiet around us. Even the receptionist stopped typing. Somewhere down the hallway, an intercom announced a physician request, but nobody near us seemed to breathe normally anymore. Ryan cleared his throat awkwardly. Mom never mentioned any of this. I almost smiled at that. Because he was right. I never had. Not when he was growing up. Not during school plays. Not during college tuition payments. Not when I quietly sold my mother's jewelry to help cover his first business loan after the bank refused him. I had spent most of my life making sure Ryan never carried the weight I carried. And somewhere along the way, my sacrifices became invisible. Amelia looked back at me, and this time her voice softened completely. Mrs. Hayes, she said gently, there are people upstairs who would cry if they knew you were here tonight. Amelia insisted on taking me upstairs herself. She pushed my wheelchair through the bright hospital corridors while Ryan and Nicole followed several steps behind in complete silence. The wheels rolled softly across the polished floor, passing nurses' stations, supply rooms, and waiting areas that looked smaller than I remembered. Everything smelled the same though. Clean linen, burnt coffee, antiseptic. Hospitals never truly changed. People did. As we turned the corner near the cardiac wing, a nurse carrying a clipboard suddenly stopped walking. Her eyes widened. Wait, she whispered. Is that Evelyn Hayes? Another nurse looked up from behind the station computer. Within seconds, faces began turning toward me one after another like old memories waking up all at once. Mrs. Hayes, someone said from down the hall. I cannot believe this. I felt my chest tighten for reasons that had nothing to do with my heart. A younger nurse hurried over holding medication cups in both hands. You trained my supervisor, she blurted out excitedly. She still talks about you. I lowered my eyes, almost embarrassed by the attention. That was a long time ago, I said softly. Amelia smiled while pressing the elevator button. Not to this hospital. Ryan stood near the wall with both hands in his pockets, watching everything unfold with growing discomfort. I could feel it without even looking at him directly. His entire posture had changed. Earlier that evening, he had spoken about me like an unpaid bill nobody wanted responsibility for. Now complete strangers were looking at me with warmth he had not shown in years. Inside the elevator, nobody spoke for several seconds. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead. Nicole finally crossed her arms and asked carefully, So you were a nurse here? Amelia let out a soft laugh before I could answer. A nurse, she repeated. Mrs. Hayes was the nurse everyone prayed to work beside during emergencies. Nicole gave a small nod, pretending interest, but I noticed the shift in her expression. It was subtle. The kind of expression people make when they suddenly realize they may have misunderstood someone completely. The elevator doors opened onto the fourth floor. Amelia guided me toward a quieter recovery area with large windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Night rain streaked softly across the glass outside, blurring the city lights into silver smudges. A nurse standing near room 412 gasped when she saw me. "No way," she whispered. Then she smiled so suddenly it almost hurt to see. "Mrs. Hayes used to bring homemade cinnamon rolls during Christmas Eve shifts," she told a younger coworker nearby. "She stayed with patients who had no family." I looked down at the thin blanket covering my knees. I had forgotten about the cinnamon rolls. I used to wake up at 4 in the morning every Christmas Eve to bake them before work because hospitals always felt lonelier during the holidays. Some patients cried more quietly on Christmas. You learn those things after enough years. Amelia stopped outside my room and rested one hand gently on my shoulder. "You took care of people for decades," she said. "Please let us take care of you tonight." Her voice carried something Ryan had not given me in a very long time. Respect. Not obligation. Not pity. Respect. I finally glanced toward my son. He looked unsettled standing there beneath the harsh hallway lights, as though he no longer understood the woman sitting in the wheelchair before him. And perhaps for the first time in his life, he realized how little he actually knew about his own mother. Ryan stayed longer than I expected that night. Nicole left around 10 after quietly complaining about parking fees and the drive home, but Ryan remained near the window with his jacket folded over one arm, watching rain slide down the glass in slow crooked lines. The room had grown quieter after visiting hours ended. Machines hummed softly beside my bed. Nurses moved through the hallway with lowered voices and careful footsteps. I could never sleep well in hospitals even back when I worked in one. There was always too much silence between the sounds. Amelia returned carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and handed one to Ryan. "Cafeteria coffee," she warned. "Still terrible after all these years." Ryan accepted it awkwardly. "Thank you, Dr. Brooks." She smiled faintly. "You can call me Amelia. Your mother used to throw pins at me when I forgot chart notes during residency." I laughed softly before taking a small sip of water. "I threw exactly 1 pin." "You terrified me," Amelia replied. "And then you stayed 3 hours after your shift helping me fix my mistakes." Ryan looked down into his coffee cup without speaking. Amelia sat in the chair beside my bed and glanced toward me carefully. "Do you remember Mr. Holloway?" she asked. I blinked in surprise. "The retired firefighter?" "Room 614, she said with a smile. "He refused medication from everyone except you." I shook my head slowly, amazed she remembered something so small after all this time. "He used to flirt with every nurse on the floor." Amelia laughed quietly. "Only because he was lonely." For several minutes, they talked about old patients and overnight shifts while rain tapped gently against the windows. I noticed Ryan listening more closely with every story. Not politely listening, truly listening. Like a man discovering hidden rooms inside a house he thought he knew completely. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mom never talks about any of this." Amelia looked genuinely confused. "Why would she not?" Ryan gave a short shrug. "I do not know. She mostly just talks about grocery prices and prescription refills now." The words were not intentionally cruel, but they still settled heavily inside the room. I looked down at the blanket covering my legs. Gray wool. Thin hospital stitching. "People stop asking after a certain age," I said quietly. "About your life, I mean." Nobody spoke after that. Somewhere down the hallway, a patient call button chimed softly. Amelia leaned back slowly in her chair and studied Ryan for a long moment before speaking again. "Your mother once stayed overnight with a teenager whose parents could not afford to miss work," she said calmly. "The girl was terrified before surgery. Evelyn braided her hair at 3 in the morning because the child said she missed her mother." Ryan looked toward me immediately. His forehead tightened slightly, almost guilty. "You never told me that." I folded my hands together. There was nothing special about it. Amelia shook her head gently. "That is exactly what made people love her here." Ryan stared quietly at the floor after that. The harsh confidence he carried earlier downstairs had disappeared completely. In its place was something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. He looked around the hospital room as if trying to understand how the woman he had reduced to medical bills and inconvenience could somehow still matter so deeply to complete strangers. Before leaving for the night, Amelia paused near the doorway. "By the way," she said softly, looking directly at me, "administration still uses your emergency response protocols during severe weather events." Ryan slowly lifted his head. Amelia smiled faintly. "Your mother helped save this hospital more times than she knows." Then she walked out, leaving only the soft sound of rain and the expression on my son's face slowly beginning to crack. Ryan returned early the next morning carrying a paper bag from the cafe across the street, and looking more tired than I had ever seen him. His dress shirt from the night before was wrinkled now, and faint shadows sat beneath his eyes as though sleep had avoided him completely. He placed the bag carefully on the small table beside my bed. "Blueberry muffin," he said awkwardly. "You used to buy those for me before school." I looked at the bag for a moment before answering. "You remembered." He gave a small shrug and pulled the visitor chair closer. The room smelled faintly of coffee and clean sheets. Outside the window, Chicago looked pale and silver beneath low morning clouds. Nurses changed shifts in the hallway while carts rolled softly past the doorway. Ryan rubbed both hands together slowly. "I stayed up last night thinking about everything Amelia said." I nodded once but said nothing. He leaned forward slightly. "Why did you never tell me any of that stuff?" His voice sounded almost frustrated now, though not angry. More like someone upset at discovering a missing piece of his own life. I opened the paper napkin around the muffin carefully before answering. "Because children are not supposed to spend their lives admiring their parents," I said quietly. "They are supposed to feel safe enough not to think about how hard their parents worked." Ryan stared at me for several seconds after that. The monitor beside my bed beeped steadily in the silence between us. "I guess I never really thought about your life before me," he admitted finally. I smiled faintly at the honesty of that. Most children never do. Not out of cruelty. Just certainty. Parents become permanent in their minds like walls or ceilings. Always there. Never questioned. Ryan looked down at his hands again. "Nicole did not know either," he said carefully. "About the hospital. About any of it." I broke off a small piece of the muffin without much appetite. "There are many things you both do not know." He looked up quickly then, almost defensive. "Like what?" I hesitated for a moment before answering because I already sensed the direction his thoughts were moving. Not toward my loneliness. Not toward regret. Toward money. Toward stability. Toward all the quiet ways I had protected him without him noticing. "Do you remember your first condo?" I asked softly. He frowned slightly. "Of course. You told your friends the bank approved your loan because your business looked promising." He nodded slowly. "That is what happened." I looked toward the rain-streaked window. "Not exactly." Ryan sat back in the chair. "What do you mean?" I folded the napkin carefully in my lap before speaking again. "The bank rejected you twice." His expression changed immediately. Confusion first. Then disbelief. "No," he said quietly. "They approved me after the second meeting. Because I used my retirement account as collateral." The room went completely still after that. Even the hallway noise outside seemed distant suddenly. Ryan blinked hard once. "What?" I kept my voice calm. "Your father begged me not to do it. We were close to 60. But you looked so defeated sitting at our kitchen table that night." Ryan shook his head slowly like he physically could not absorb the words. "Mom, no. You never told me that." "You were proud," I answered gently. "I did not want to take that from you." His eyes dropped immediately toward the floor. I watched his throat tighten slightly. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, my son no longer looked irritated or embarrassed by me. He looked ashamed. And somehow that hurt far more than the billing desk ever did. Ryan barely spoke for the next hour. He remained seated beside the hospital bed while untouched coffee grew cold in his hands and morning light slowly brightened the city outside the window. I could almost hear his memories rearranging themselves inside his mind. Children build stories about their parents very early in life, and most never question them again. To Ryan, I had simply always existed. The woman who packed lunches, paid bills, remembered birthdays, answered late-night phone calls. He had never stopped to ask what those sacrifices cost me because he assumed mothers were designed to survive anything quietly. Around noon, Amelia returned carrying a clipboard and reading glasses balanced low on her nose. "Good news," she said warmly. "Your tests look stable. If everything stays consistent tonight, you may go home tomorrow." "Thank you," I replied. Ryan stood immediately. "Can I speak with you outside for a second?" Amelia glanced at me briefly before nodding. The hallway outside my room was calm except for distant monitor sounds and the occasional squeak of rolling carts. Through the cracked doorway, I could still hear pieces of their conversation. "Why did nobody ever tell me any of this?" Ryan asked quietly. Amelia answered gently. "Because your mother was never interested in being praised." There was a pause. Then Ryan spoke again, lower this time. "I feel like I do not even know her." Amelia sighed softly. "That happens more than you think with parents." A few minutes later Ryan returned alone. His face looked different somehow, softer around the edges. He sat down slowly beside my bed and rested his elbows on his knees. "I called Dad's old friend this morning," he said. "Mr. Bennett." I looked up in surprise. "George Bennett." He told me about the hardware store. I stared at him silently for a moment. There was no reason for him to remember that. Ryan let out a dry laugh without humor. "Apparently everybody remembers things about you except me." He rubbed one hand across his forehead before continuing. "He said Dad almost lost the store after the recession in 2008. I folded my hands quietly in my lap. Business was difficult for many people. Ryan looked directly at me now. "He said you worked night shifts here for nearly 2 years to keep the store open." I said nothing. Outside the window, rainwater slid slowly down the glass in thin silver streams. "Mom," he whispered, "why would you do that at your age?" I almost smiled at the question because only a parent truly understands how simple the answer is. "Because your father loved that store," I said softly. "And because you loved helping him there after school." Ryan lowered his eyes immediately. I could see emotion rising in him now, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. "I remember you falling asleep in the recliner every night around that time," he admitted quietly. "I thought you were just tired." I was tired. The room became still again. Then Ryan asked the question I think had been sitting inside him since last night. "How much did you give up for me?" I looked at him carefully before answering because there was no anger left in me anymore. Only truth. "Enough," I said gently. He swallowed hard and leaned back in the chair. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then his phone buzzed against his leg. Nicole's name lit up brightly across the screen. Ryan stared at it but did not answer right away. "She thinks I am overreacting," he admitted quietly. "About all of this." I nodded once because that did not surprise me. Nicole had always understood value in numbers. Salary, mortgage, investments, appearances. But she had never understood invisible debt. The kind built slowly over decades by one person sacrificing pieces of their own life, so someone else could move forward without fear. Ryan silenced the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. Then for the first time since he walked into that hospital, he reached over carefully and held my hand without saying a single word. That evening, Amelia convinced me to walk slowly through the cardiac wing instead of staying in bed another night. "Just one lap around the floor," she said with the same calm authority she used years ago as a nervous resident trying to sound confident. Ryan walked beside me while I held onto the railing attached to the hallway wall. The hospital lights reflected softly across the polished floor, and every few feet another nurse or technician seemed to stop when they recognized me. Some smiled warmly. Some touched my shoulder. One older janitor paused with his cleaning cart and stared at me for several seconds before breaking into a grin. "Miss Evelyn," he said, "you still walking these halls?" I laughed quietly. "Only a little slower now." He shook his head with genuine affection. "You sat with my wife after her surgery back in 2003. She never forgot that." Ryan looked at me after the man walked away. There was disbelief in his face now, but also something deeper. Grief maybe. Not for losing me. For realizing he had already started losing me years ago without noticing. We reached the small family lounge near the elevators where Amelia had arranged coffee and sandwiches for a few former staff members finishing late shifts. "Nothing fancy," she said as we walked in. "Just people who wanted to see you." The room smelled like coffee and tomato soup. Rain tapped softly against the windows while tired. Nurses sat around a circular table sharing stories from overnight rotations. The moment I stepped inside, several people stood immediately. "Mrs. Hayes," one woman whispered with a smile. "I cannot believe this." Another nurse with silver hair pulled me gently into a hug. "You were the reason I stayed in nursing after my divorce," she said quietly near my ear. "You told me exhausted women were still strong women." I felt emotion rise unexpectedly in my chest, but I kept my composure. Ryan remained near the doorway at first, listening silently while people spoke about moments I barely remembered myself. A snowstorm during an emergency blackout. A frightened child before surgery. A widower who cried after losing his wife. Story after story unfolded around that small hospital lounge, and with every memory, I watched my son grow quieter. Finally, one of the older nurses looked toward Ryan. "You must be Evelyn's boy," she said warmly. He nodded once. "Ryan." The nurse smiled gently. "Your mother used to carry your school pictures in her locker." His expression shifted immediately. "She did. Every year," another nurse added. "She bragged about you constantly." Ryan lowered his eyes toward the paper cup in his hands. I could almost see the guilt settling deeper inside him now. Not dramatic guilt. The quiet kind. The kind that arrives slowly when someone realizes they were loved far better than they deserved. Nicole arrived halfway through the gathering wearing a cream sweater and carrying her phone tightly in one hand. The moment she entered the lounge, she froze slightly at the sight of everyone surrounding me. Amelia greeted her politely, but Nicole's smile looked strained. She sat beside Ryan and whispered something under her breath. He answered without looking at her. "Not now." It was the first time I had ever heard that tone directed toward his wife. Nicole glanced around the room again as another nurse described how I once paid for a patient's bus ticket home after discharge because the woman had nowhere else to go. I noticed Nicole studying me carefully then, almost uneasily, as though she suddenly realized the elderly woman she dismissed as financially inconvenient had once been someone people deeply admired. Before leaving the lounge, Amelia handed me an old hospital badge preserved inside a small plastic sleeve. My younger face stared back at me beneath the faded hospital logo. Ryan looked at the badge for several long seconds. Then he whispered something so quietly I almost did not hear it at all. "I should have known who you were." The next afternoon, the hospital discharged me just after 3 o'clock. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city washed clean beneath pale autumn sunlight. Ryan carried my overnight bag while I walked slowly beside him through the lobby with one hand resting lightly against his arm. The same billing desk stood near the entrance where he had refused to pay for my treatment less than 48 hours earlier. Neither of us looked directly at it as we passed. Outside, cold air brushed softly against my face as automatic doors opened toward the parking area. Ryan unlocked the passenger side of his SUV immediately. "You should stay with us for a while," he said quietly. "At least until you fully recover." I paused before getting inside the car. A week ago, those words would have sounded comforting. Now they felt complicated. "That is kind of you," I answered gently, "but I will be all right at home." Ryan looked disappointed but did not argue. During the drive, he kept glancing toward me at stoplights as though he wanted to say something important but could not find the correct words yet. Chicago traffic crawled slowly beneath gray afternoon skies while radio voices murmured softly in the background. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat. "Nicole and I talked last night." I looked out the window at rows of brick buildings passing by. "And?" He tightened both hands on the steering wheel. "She thinks maybe we have not been paying enough attention to you." The careful wording almost made me smile. "Maybe." Ryan exhaled heavily through his nose. "All right. We have not." Silence settled between us again for several blocks. Then he spoke more quietly. "I keep thinking about that night downstairs. At the billing desk." I said nothing. I sounded horrible. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "You sounded tired," I answered calmly. "No," he said immediately. "I sounded selfish." The honesty surprised me enough that I finally turned toward him fully. Ryan stared straight ahead at traffic. I spent years thinking you needed me, he admitted. But now I realize I built most of my life on things you quietly sacrificed for. I folded my hands together in my lap and watched sunlight flicker across the dashboard. Parents do not keep score, I said softly. Maybe they should sometimes. That answer stayed with me long after he parked outside my small brick townhouse. Fallen leaves gathered along the sidewalk while distant lawn equipment hummed somewhere down the block. Ryan carried my bag inside and stopped abruptly near the hallway table when he noticed several folders spread neatly across the surface. "What is all this?" he asked. I removed my coat slowly before answering. "Paperwork." He stepped closer and picked up one folder carefully. The name of my attorney sat printed across the top in dark blue letters. Ryan looked back at me immediately. "Mom." I walked into the kitchen and filled a kettle with water before speaking again. "After your father died, I updated some things." Ryan followed me slowly. "What things?" I rested one hand against the counter and looked toward the dining room window where late afternoon light glowed softly through lace curtains. "My will. My accounts. The house." His expression tightened with visible discomfort now. "Why are you telling me this?" I turned toward him calmly. "Because surviving a hospital changes certain priorities." Ryan stared at me silently. I could see concern rising behind his eyes now, mixed with fear. Not fear of losing me entirely. Fear that perhaps he already had. Then his gaze shifted toward one specific document partially visible inside the folder on the table. The heading read, St. Catherine Nursing Scholarship Endowment. 6 months later, the first snow of December drifted quietly across downtown Chicago, while Ryan stood alone inside St. Catherine Medical Center holding a small white envelope in both hands. The hospital lobby looked different, decorated with Christmas garlands and soft golden lights wrapped around the reception desk, but the memory of that night still lingered there for him like a bruise that had never fully faded. He glanced toward the billing counter where he once complained about paying for my care, and lowered his eyes almost immediately. Shame still arrived quickly now. Some lessons stayed permanent. A volunteer directed him toward the East Wing Auditorium, where the annual Nursing Foundation ceremony was being held. Ryan loosened his tie while walking slowly through the crowded hallway. Nurses in formal uniforms moved between tables carrying programs and coffee cups while quiet piano music floated through nearby speakers. He looked nervous in a way I had never seen before. Not like a businessman preparing for a meeting. Like a son arriving too late to understand something important. Amelia spotted him first near the auditorium entrance. "Ryan," she said warmly. "You made it." He nodded once. I almost turned around twice in the parking garage. Amelia smiled softly because she understood exactly what he meant. She would still be happy you came. Ryan looked past her toward the stage where a large photograph stood beneath soft lighting. My old hospital portrait. The same one from the faded employee badge. Beneath it, silver letters stretched across a navy banner. The Evelyn Hayes Compassion Scholarship. Ryan stared at the sign without moving. "I did not know it would be this big," he whispered. Amelia folded her hands calmly. "Your mother funded full tuition for nursing students who cannot afford school." He blinked slowly. "With her retirement money?" Amelia nodded. "Most of it." Ryan swallowed hard and looked down at the envelope in his hands. Inside was the repayment check for every dollar I had quietly given him over the years after he insisted on calculating it himself. Condo assistance, business loans, mortgage help, even small transfers I barely remembered anymore. He had spent months digging through bank records trying to measure sacrifices that were never meant to be measured. "She refused to take it," he admitted quietly. Amelia smiled faintly. "That sounds like Evelyn." The ceremony began a few minutes later. Ryan sat alone in the second row while speakers described dedication, compassion, and dignity in patient care. Several older nurses shared stories about me between applause and tears. Ryan listened silently to every word. Sometimes he smiled faintly. Sometimes he stared at the floor. But he never once looked at his phone. Near the end of the ceremony, Amelia stepped onto the stage holding a small note card. "There is one thing Evelyn Hayes asked me to say tonight," she announced gently. The room grew still. Amelia looked directly toward Ryan before reading aloud. People think growing old makes a woman smaller. It does not. It simply reveals who noticed her value before the world stopped looking. Ryan lowered his head immediately. His shoulders trembled once as emotion finally caught up with him completely. After the applause faded, people slowly began leaving the auditorium, while snow continued falling softly beyond the windows. Ryan remained seated alone for several minutes staring at my photograph beneath the warm stage lights. Then quietly, almost like a prayer no one else was meant to hear, he whispered, "I finally saw my mother." And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.